Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 16 on the War of the Jewels. This is intended to be the penultimate session on the War of the Jewels. We will see. We'll see how we go along here. Tonight, we're going to focus pretty much entirely on the Tale of Years near the end of the War of the Jewels. Next time, we'll get to the to his that final essay, Quendi and Eldar, the highly linguistic essay there at the end. So we'll do that. We'll do that next time. Yes, as several of you are pointing out, it is in fact my birthday today. But happy to share my birthday with you, talking about War of the Jewels. Man, it has been a long time. In real time, I know for people who are watching this later, this is just the next session on the playlist. In real time, it's been a while since our previous session. What I'm gonna go backwards a little bit. We had started doing the comparison of the text. He did essentially 4 versions with some additions, in there, of the Tale of Years. And I want to look at the development and evolution of the Tale of Years for a couple reasons there. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of Stage A and kind of go through those again, because I know I am not going to retain all of the details of the things we were looking at the very end last time. But just to recall you to sort of the setup of what we're looking at there. You remember the overall flow of the way that his writing had been going, right? He began telling stories, longer narratives. Then he started doing the synopsis, right? What began with literally attempting to write a plot summary for a friend to give some context to the alliterative children of Húrin becomes ultimately the Quenta Silmarillion form, this, to use Christopher's delightful word, epitomizing form, the plot summary genre, as I've called it. And then he shifts from that to, on top of that, begins to compile the annals, right? Where the annals are taking the flow of the narrative, but tracking it year by year so that he can, and it seems to have begun as a way to kind of keep track of those things, just to write a summary of the main events so that he can correlate it year by year and make sure he's keeping the chronology straight. But of course, as he does it, it expands, right? Until, as we saw, especially here in the Annals of Aman and the Grey Annals, these latter versions of, the Annals of Valinor and the Annals of Beleriand, these later versions of the Annals, the revised versions that he did in the early 50s, they begin to expand until large sections of narrative and even dialogue come out of that. In fact, many of the, sort of most famous and memorable moments from the published Silmarillion emerge not in the context of his longer form stories, even in the context of his Quenta Silmarillion, but in the context of the Annals. But of course, in the process of this, they cease to really be like annals anymore. They cease to be a list of dates and events, and become a sequential narrative, which is seems to be more or less duplicating what was going on in the Quenta. And we've seen some evidence over the course of the War of the Jewels that he hadn't given up on the idea of doing the annals and the Quenta side by side, but that increasingly they seem to be kind of redundant, and both of them being kind of overtaken by his desire as he went on in the post-Lord of the Rings period. Being overtaken by the desire to write really long-form stories and to be writing in a very different kind of detail. The kind of in-depth world building that he's done. Again, this, if you know the nature of Middle-earth, is his period of doing math to work out Elvish genealogical tables and that kind of thing. all the work that he did on Elvish gestation periods and stuff like that all comes from this period. His desire to write this longer form narrative, and we began to see some of that even in the Wanderings of Húrin, and of course his longer tale of Túrin, which is sort of finally put together and published in long form by Christopher in the Children of Húrin, the volume The Children of Húrin. Anyway, that's kind of where he's been. So then at the end of all this, right, what does he do? He starts writing the Tale of Years, right? And he originally worked on the Tale of Years. He did a version of the Tale of Years way back in 1937, but we see him coming back to that in 1950, and then we see him revising and developing this, which really did seem to be, since the annals have gotten out of hand, right? He wanted again just a list of dates, as clearly he was not only was he losing track in some ways of some of the dates, but he was changing things. We talked about this when we were looking at the Myglin narrative, which Christopher said was the last substantive narrative that he rewrote in full, was the Myglin narrative. And it seems pretty clear why he chose that out, because Myglin was the big problem when it came to figuring out Elvish maturation rates and all that stuff, how to fit the Myglin narrative into the Elvish world building that he was doing at that time. Given the age of elves and how they count time and years and how they mature and everything else, how can Myglin have enough time to be born in the midst of the siege of Angband and yet still have time to grow up and betray it and become, the romantic rival of Tuor and all that kind of thing. So we saw him reworking the Myglin narrative. So he was doing a lot of reworking of dates and things during this time. Moreover, he is getting to the point. He is looking ahead in the Tale of Years, at the end of the Tale of Years. He's looking ahead to the period where his narratives have kind of run out, where he has not rewritten stuff. He began, of course, as we all know, to rework the Tale of Gondolin, to do a new, longer version of the Tale of the Fall of Gondolin, but he didn't get anywhere close to finishing it, right? As we know from Unfinished Tales, he got only to the point where Tuor was about to see Gondolin for the first time, and then stopped and never returned to it. So the Tale of Gondolin was never reworked. That's one of the kind of most prominent things. But of course, there are many other parts that didn't get fully reworked because he never got past Túrin. It's all Túrin's fault, really, right? Because every time he was working on the Quenta or any of those things, he would get as far as the Túrin story, and then it would take over, right? And he would spend all this time working on and developing the Túrin story, and he never really finished. After the Quenta in Uldarinwa, which he wrote like in 1930, he never finished the Quenta to the end. And so it's not just, details about the War of Wrath and the end of Morgoth and even forward to the end of Days and the Dagor Daggerath and all that kind of thing. Not only do we not get that stuff, which we talked about some before, but even the latter stages of the Wars of Beleriand, such as, very prominently, the Fall of Doriath, as well as the Fall of Gondolin, right? So all that stuff is uncertain. He didn't write those narratives. He hasn't written anything on that since way, way back, since he included it in the Quenta in Uldarinwa, and he did a little bit in the Sketch of the Mythology, which is his first, earliest, shortest plot summary thing. And then, of course, what he wrote about it in the Book of Lost Tales ages ago, back, before 1920. And then, of course, there's more, right? Then there's the Eärendil stuff, the stories of the voyages of Eärendil and what happens between the day when Eärendil is taken as lord of the, havens of Valar down there where all the refugees live, until Eärendil arrives in Valinor and indeed returns from Valinor. Like, what happened there? What was going on there? Tolkien had a notion in his early days. I mean, like back in his 20s, he had a notion that there were lots and lots of stories there. He wanted this whole saga of the epic voyage, the adventures of Eärendil at sea, right? This sort of Odyssey-esque or like, larger version of the, Voyage of the Dawn Treader-esque, I guess sort of episodic, adventures at sea set of stories with Eärendil, right? Including, yes, David Michael, the never-written Eärendil versus Ungoliant prize fight commentary. Exactly. We get some scattered notes about that, even in the Book of Lost Tales, and he never wrote those. Never wrote those stories. We get some notes about it way back in the Book of Lost Tales. We get a couple, wavings in their direction in the Quentin Olderin book, but we get very, very little. So, there are a couple things for us to be looking at as we go through the different versions. There are 4 basic stages of the Tale of Years as he's revising it here. And what I want to look at as we watch the development of his ideas over time, I want to be looking at things like, what is he concerned about? What do we see him changing and tinkering with, right? What does that tell us about where Tolkien's own creative energies are being focused during this time, right? So this is a thing that is really hard for us, that I think actually kind of requires a lot of discipline on our part. And you can see it even requires discipline on Christopher's part. That is to say, it's really easy for us to read this and we have things we want Tolkien to say, right? Things that we wish he were doing. The things which, requests we would put in, we would have put into Tolkien, right? As you're working through the Tale of Years, this is a great opportunity for you to sort out some of the major plot points of this story. So even if we never get the stories told in full, we can at least know how you wanted the story to go, right? So, we'd appreciate it, Professor, if you would, take some time fleshing that out for us, right? Christopher is clearly hoping for that too. But again, this is where I say it requires a little discipline, because we have to make sure that we don't let what we ourselves are rooting for cover over or distract us from what Tolkien's actually doing, right? That is to say, we can't be looking so hard for the evidence of the things that we want to see that we miss what he was doing, right? We can't be pursuing our interests so hard that we fail to notice what he was interested in, right? So that's one thing I want to be doing as we're going through the Tale of Years. Another thing I want to be doing is I want to be taking this as I think a very interesting instance of one of the biggest patterns that we've been looking at consistently throughout our discussion of the War of the Jewels. That is, what kind of stories is he interested in? What is, the question I have been sort of comically asking is what is this? What is this thing, right? We're asking that about the Grey Annals from the beginning. What are we reading? What does Tolkien think he's doing, right? What can we see about that? Not just in the Tale of Years itself, but in how the Tale of Years changes over time, right? What does Tolkien think he's doing? What does he think he's writing here? What can we see about sort of the shifts in the narrative mode in that sense of the Tale of Years? And then, of course, I think it's perfectly fair for us to be thinking about sort of comparing and contrasting what we see in the Tale of Years with what we get in the published Silmarillion, especially in the chapter about the ruin of Doriath. Now, we're going to end this, and I have some hopes. I have no hope of getting to this tonight. The section at the end of the Tale of Years, where Christopher discusses this explicitly and gets into sort of quasi-confessional mode and tells us the story of what happened and how that chapter came about, right? But of course, it's an interesting item, because there have been many times it would have been too difficult. It would have taken too much. It would have added too much time to this discussion. So I kind of leave it to you to do this on your own. For me to be bringing in passages from the published Silmarillion to kind of put alongside these to remind you. But if you know the published Silmarillion, there will have been many points. We talked about this back in the Grey Annals, for instance, where familiar passages, the entire of Men chapter, right, where the whole, anyway, lots of stuff has been emerging from the Annals of Valinor and the Grey Annals, of the Sindar chapter, right, and we both can sort of see where the text that Christopher took and placed into those chapters came from, but also we can kind of see a different context for it, which is really fascinating, right? In Tolkien's drafts where they originally came up. Now, here it's kind of a different thing, right? Instead of observing when those bubbles of familiar text, right, those familiar paragraphs that we know from the published Silmarillion, when those kind of rise to the surface so that we can see where Christopher took them from. Instead, what we're going to be seeing is the void, right? Like the absences which Christopher had to fill in, the mysteries which Christopher had to solve. So we'll kind of take some note of that stuff as we go through the Tale of Years, and then we'll see. We'll come back to what Christopher describes about it there at the end. All right. Without further ado, let's dig into things. Okay, so here's stage A. Now, the first thing to notice is how brief these entries are. This is really, it begins really as a list, right? Just trying to keep track of the years of the sun here in which these things happen. And what Christopher has given us here is all the later stuff, right? So we're going to be starting right around this same time, right around the year 500, all the way through. 500, birth of Eärendil and Gondolin. 501, making of the Nauglamir. Thingol quarrels with the dwarves. Okay. Note here that the Nauglamir itself, which has already changed its name, right? Back in the old days, like back in the Book of Lost Tales, it was called the Nauglafring. Its name is changed to the Nauglamir. Notice that in these versions of the story, the forging of the Nauglamir, you'll remember in the published Silmarillion, there's two stages, right? There's the making of the Nauglamir for Finrod, Felagund, with his Valinorian gems, right? So you've got Nauglamir Mark I, the awesome version that Finrod has. And then you have, of course, remember in the published Silmarillion, we get that moment where Thingol is like, I got the Nauglamir, I've got the Silmaril, right? Maybe if I put this chocolate and peanut butter together, we can make something awesome, right? And then he approaches the dwarves. Again, it's all in the published Silmarillion. He approaches the dwarves and is like, hey, could you do a thing here, right? Could you remake the Nauglamir? And they're like, dude, the Nauglamir, that's like the greatest work of dwarf craftsmen ever. But we'll have a go, right? And they set out to make Nauglamir Mark II, which goes from awesome, as it was, to like mind-blowingly spectacular. So glorious it imperils life and limb to be near it kind of deal, right? But again, the point here is that in this synopsis, there's just one making of the Nauglamir, right? That second making, the Silmaril is included in the Nauglamir from the very beginning, right? There's no pre-existing state for the Nauglamir. This is important, I think, for two reasons. One, because of, again, we should observe the difference between the published Silmarillion version and this. But second, this is enormously significant because of the role that the pre-existing Nauglafring played in the earlier story. Or rather, what it was wrapped up in, right? The story of the Nauglafring was about the curse of Meme, right? The curse of Meme was so important. I mean, I've talked about this, I know. It was became almost more important than the Silmarils. The curse that Meme lays upon the gold of Nargothrond, and that's the gold that's then used to combine with the Silmaril in order to make the Nauglafring. So the one-time making of the Nauglafring is not a new idea; it's an old idea. But the Nauglafring was connected from the beginning. It was the instrument of the curse of Meme, and how the curse of Meme the dwarf does its harm everywhere, right? And this sort of tragedy of having this, not only this greatest artifact, this greatest working of the dwarves, but even the Silmaril itself, one of the Silmarils itself, themselves being incorporated into this deadly, radioactive, spiritually radioactive thing, right? That would bring down whole kingdoms because of the power of the curse of Meme. So he is not here talking about, there's no reference to the curse, you'll notice here. He doesn't talk about the curse of Meme. That's really interesting because it was so huge before, right? But the idea of the Nauglamir being that essential bone of contention between Thingol and the dwarves is definitely implicit there. Okay, all right. 502. The dwarves invade Doriath. Thingol is slain and his realm ended. Melian returns to Valinor. Beren destroys the dwarf host at Rath Loriel. Beren destroying the dwarf host at Rath Loriel was the original version of that story. That's what happened back in the Quentin Eldarin version of the story. Beren led an army of green elves who ambush the dwarves at the ford and kills them all. And it's called Rath Loriel, which is like the golden ford because the cursed gold, ends up there, right, in the river. Okay. Beren destroys the dwarf host at Rath Loriel. 506, the second kinslaying. There you go. 507, the Doriath one, right? 507, the fall of Gondolin, death of King Turgon. 508, the gathering of the remnants of the elves at the mouths of Sirion is begun. 524, Tuor and Idril depart overseas. So we get, 16 years of peace and happiness under Tuor and Idril and and Eärendil, and Eärendil and Elwing are meeting and everything else, right? So we got 16 years, right, before Tuor and Idril take off, go out to sea. 525, the voyages of Eärendil begun. So that begins the phase of his adventuresome period, right? When he begins to sail the seas after his mom and dad take off. Dolorous Stroke, the cursed gold in a river thing, the whole curse of Meme business, it was extremely Nibelung adjacent. Extremely it was very Germanic. Never have Tolkien's dwarves seemed more Germanic epic than in the original story of the Naglafring, for sure. Okay. Right, Voyage of Eärendil, the third and last kinslaying. So this is when, of course, the refuge at the mouths of Sirion gets wrecked 4 years after the voyages begin. 533, so again, that's 4 further years, right? So it's now been 8 years since he began his voyaging. Half as much time as Tuor and Idril kind of led the refugees there in peace. Eärendil comes to Valinor. 540. 7 years after Eärendil comes to Valinor. The last free elves and remnants of the Fathers of Men are driven out of Beleriand and take refuge in the Isle of Valar. 547, the host of the Valar comes up out of the west. So 14 years after Eärendil's arrival in Valinor, the host of the Valar comes up out of the west. Fionwe, son of Manwe, lands in Beleriand with great power. 550 to 97. A 47-year war, a 50-year war from the time when they land, right? It takes 3 years before they really get down to business, apparently. And yes, Fionwe, son of Manwe. We talked about that. I remember talking about that last time. Yeah, there we are. There we have it. Fionwe, son of Manwe. The last war of the Elder Days and the great battle is begun. In this war, Beleriand is broken and destroyed, Morgoth is at last utterly overcome, and Angband is unroofed and unmade. Morgoth is bound, and the last 2 Silmarils are regained. 597, Maedhros and Maglor, last surviving sons of Feanor, seize the Silmarils. Maedhros perishes. The Silmarils are lost in fire and sea. 600, the elves and the Fathers of Men depart from Middle-earth and pass over sea. Here ends the first age of the children of Iluvatar. All right, so there's a lot in this which recalls older stuff, right? We talked about the date of this last time. This does seem to be the version that he does in 1950, but he's working very closely from the one that he did in 1937. So he's still incorporating things that you think you might not, right? Like Fionwe, son of Manwe. But anyway, there it is. So there is a lot of older stuff. Though again, what I'm noticing, one of the things that I'm noticing here, again, no reference to the Curse of Meme. Meme's name doesn't come up anywhere from 500 to 600, right? So that does suggest to me a broadly different focus of the story from the version of the Tale of the Naughlif Ring and the later version and the later stories that we got. I mean, even the Voyage of Eärendil itself was being impacted by the Curse of Meme, according to the Book of Lost Tales versions. But anyway, so he's easing back. I'm not saying that the Curse of Meme is not involved at all. I'm just saying the fact that it's not only is it not the whole story, it's not even alluded to in this passage, right? Suggests that he is definitely at this point moving towards a significant reduction of that concept. Okay, stage B. Now we're revising. 501, Return of Húrin. 502, after 7 years' service, Tuor weds Idril of Gondolin. Making of the Nauglamir. Thingol quarrels with the dwarves. 503, Birth of Eärendil in Gondolin. The dwarves invade Doriath. Thingol is slain and his realm ended. Melian takes Nauglamir to Beren and Luthien and then returns to Valinor. Celegorm and Curufin destroy the dwarf host at Sarn Athrad and Rathloriel and are wroth to find the Silmaril not there. Dior goes to Doriath. 505, Spring. Second death of Beren, and Luthien dies also. Dior Thingol's heir wears Silmaril, struck out, and returns to Doriath. 509, Spring. Second kinslaying. Last warning of Olmo to Gondolin. 510, the fall of Gondolin at midsummer. Death of King Turgon. 511, the gathering of the remnants of the elves at the mouths of Sirion is begun. Okay. It's not the all of stage B. But, so what do we notice that's happening here? Notice our entries are getting longer. Apart from the Return of Húrin, there are very few things that are just lists, right? This is not just a list. This is a much more thoroughgoing narrative, right? We're getting a much clearer sense of the shape of the whole story. So it's growing a little bit, right? What do we notice about... yeah, we are getting dangerously close in places to dipping into a zoom-in narrative story. Yeah, for sure. What do we notice about... So notice how he is interested in one, and this is one of the reasons to do the Tale of Years, right? Is to look more closely at the interweaving of these, well, I'll call them three stories, right? The story of Gondolin, the story of Beren, Luthien, and Doriath, and the story of the Sons of Fëanor, right? How these three things all kind of come together and how they line up with each other. I think it can't be any mistake here, or not a mistake, but it's not merely a coincidence, nor is it, I think, merely a sort of narrative necessity that he decides that the very year that Eärendil is born in Gondolin is the year in which Thingol is slain and the realm of Doriath is ended, right? The way that he's kind of overlaying these narratives together seems to me significant there, and that he's really sort of showing how these things go together. Another thing that I would point out here, the biggest change as far as like an actual alteration of the story that he, not rather than just a more detail, right, that he's giving in this portion. So he, the biggest change is the introduction of the Fëanorians, right? It's no longer Beren and the Grey Elves who are ambushing the dwarves as they return out of Doriath, having come from sacking Doriath, right? So the battle at Sarnathrad is no longer Beren. It's now Celegorm and Curufin. That's really interesting, right? What does that do? What is the effect of that change? What does he gain by making that particular change to the narrative, right? I think what he gains from it is, I would say there's a thing that he gains and there's a thing that it suggests to me. The thing that he gains is it grants a little bit of narrative, I was going to say consistency, but that's not quite right. Immediacy, force, right? To the kinslaying stuff. Like what, without that, when we had before, right? I mean, if you look back, no, not forward, back. Making of the Nauglamir, Thingol quarrels with the dwarves invade Doria, Thingol is slain, Melian returns to Valinor, Beren destroys the dwarf host, the second kinslaying. Whoa. Okay. That's kind of out of nowhere. I mean, it's not, we know the Silmarill's there, right? It's legit. But you know, that shift, it's like a now for something completely different. Like you'll remember when I was reading through, I felt the impulse to remind you of the context, like what we're even talking about. Oh, remember, that's when the Fëanorians attacked Doriath, right? Because again, we're given no context. Now, in Stage B, the idea that Celegorm and Curufin would ambush the dwarf host as it's returning from Doriath with the loot, right? They've sacked Doriath and they're returning to their mountains. That Celegorm and Curufin would say, okay, we're going to ambush them because they will have taken the Silmaril, right? This makes sense on a whole lot of levels, doesn't it? Right? It's exactly what Celegorm and Curufin would do. And indeed, it even makes them, well, I don't want to say sympathetic, because Celegorm and Curufin rarely get to that level, but more understandable, right? I mean, you can see, can't you, how that's actually kind of a clever way of easing them into their villain role. The next stage, they were kind of villains in Beren and Luthien already anyway, of course, as we know, but no, I mean, but you see what I mean? Instead of just having the second kinslaying come out of nowhere, right? Like, we're just gonna bust out and invade Doriath and kill lots of other elves because they won't give us the Silmaril back, right? Instead of having that just emerge and happen, and instead we have this middle stage where Celegorm and Curufin, hearing about the sack of Doriath, don't mourn because whatever, Thingol was a jerk and wouldn't give them the Silmaril anyway. But what an opportunity, right? What an opportunity for them. Now they can regain the Silmaril without invading an elf kingdom or doing any kinslaying, because the dwarves did it for them. How convenient, right? So now they can ambush the dwarves, get back the Silmaril, no kin are slain, right? I mean, okay, yeah, that works. But they're foiled, right? Because they ambush the dwarves and they get no Silmaril, right? No Silmaril. They don't care about the rest of the gold, whatever. They're wroth because the Silmaril isn't there. But now, right, now they've made a move. They've claimed the Silmaril. They've made a move to get the Silmaril back. They've, at least in their own minds, gotten close to the, like, they thought they were going to get the Silmaril. Like, it was, as far as they knew, just within their grasp, and now it's gone again. And it's much easier now, anyway, for me at least, to be able to see how that escalates quickly, right? In their wrath and frustration at their plan not working out. And, oh man, you're still going to withhold the Silmaril from us now, and how that moves on to the second kinslaying. 6 years later, right? Not immediately. So anyway, so that's one thing that I find really interesting about that. The second thing is, again, simply the way in which this change itself also really continues the shift in the narrative dynamic that I was already observing in Stage A. The shift that is away from the Curse of Meme and back to the Silmarils and the Oath of Fëanor as the primary movers of events. By replacing Beren with Celegorm and Curufin, it accomplishes a couple different things, right? First, again, it brings that focus to the Oath of Fëanor. It brings the Oath of Fëanor. Now, again, this is once again a story about the Silmarils and the Oath of Fëanor, and that's what's going to dominate, for the next, all the way up until Eärendil gets to Valinor, right? But the second thing that it does is it eases a tension that always seemed to me, Beren's retirement after his resurrection, right? The published Silmarillion asks us to believe, right? The story that it gives us is that Beren comes out of retirement on one occasion. Like, he doesn't fight any more battles after his return from death, except one, right? When the dwarves are coming out of Doriath, he does come out of retirement, rally the green elves, near whom he and Luthien have been living, and fights a battle against the dwarves in order to regain the treasure, avenge Thingol. Especially when the Silmaril isn't there, which it isn't in this version of the story, or Stage A version of the story. It's hard to see what's motivating Beren. Again, vengeance, greed, spite against the dwarves. I'm not going to let you have the treasure. It's, I'm not saying there's no sympathy at all there. I agree. Thingol was his father-in-law. One could understand him being a little bit upset, but as I say, I feel tension anyway between what I'm being asked to believe of Beren. They're like, really? Post-resurrection Beren is going to be like, for vengeance, let us slaughter the dwarves. I'm like, it takes a lot of believing, as Ham Gamgee would say, right? Now replace Beren and the Green Elves with Celegorm and Curufin and the army of the Feanorians, laying an ambush and slaughtering the dwarves wholesale in their attempt to recover the Silmaril, and I'll buy that for $1, right? I mean, yeah, that tracks. I got no problems whatsoever with that. And now Beren doesn't have to come out of retirement, right? Now Beren can stay in his sort of peaceful post-resurrection, retirement home, right? With little retirement cottage with Luthien. I think there's a lot to like about this innovation in the narrative there. Notice also, I should have said this at the beginning when we were observing the increased detail here in Stage B. Notice things like spring, midsummer, right? Again, it's not just a list of this thing happened in this year. He's beginning to picture it in his head, right? It's not just important that Beren and Luthien die again in 505, in the year 505, right? It happens in the spring. That's important, right? It's like a whole narrative context there, right? And the same thing. Second kinslaying, that also has to happen in the spring. Again, I think you can picture, I believe, when he writes the word spring in parentheses there, this is Tolkien himself visualizing this. He's imagining, like, what do the trees of Doriath look like as the Feanorian army is coming in? As Maedhros is running through the forest there in Doriath, searching for the lost princes, the lost elf princes. Are the trees in bloom, right? What's going on there? So again, we can see he's investing more in this as he revises it, as of course should surprise no one, right? Okay, Stage C, third version. Return of Húrin from captivity, 501. Return of Húrin from captivity. He goes to Nargothrond and seizes the treasure of Glaurung, 502. Making of the Nauglamir. Thingol quarrels with the dwarves, 503. Notice Meme not even mentioned there. Seizing the treasure of Glaurung, and you'd never even know that Meme was involved. 503. The dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod invade Doriath. Thingol is slain and his realm ended. The dwarves carry off the dragon gold, but Melian escaped and carried off the Nauglamir and the Silmaril and brought it to Beren and Luthien. Then she returned to Valinor, but Luthien wore the Silmaril. Now Curufin and Celegorm, hearing of the sack of Menegroth, ambushed the dwarves at the fords of Askar and defeated them, but the dwarves cast the gold into the river, which was after named Rathloriel. Great was the chagrin of the sons of Feanor to discover that the Silmaril was not with the dwarves, but they dared not assail Luthien. Dior goes to Doriath and endeavors to re-establish the realm. 504, changed to 502. Tuor wedded Idril Celebrindal, Turgon's daughter of Gondolin. He was going to move the wedding, right? But notice he's moving it back to 502. Why? I think because he still wants the birth of Fearendal to coincide with the fall of Doriath, right? Yeah. Yeah, but they dared not assail Luthien. I agree, Scott. That is pretty awesome. But they dared not assail Luthien. It's not just that they thought the optics would be really, really bad. It's not just because they knew that, every elf would be against them if they did. No, they don't. Because they're scared of Luthien. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So exactly, Emily, because she'd kick their butts. Exactly right. Yes. Now, as we can see, as is hardly surprising, his sliding into fuller narrative is advancing, right, more and more. Notice there's several sentences in there which are beginning to sound exactly like the tone of the Quenta Silmarillion, right? I think in particular of, great was the chagrin of the sons of Feanor to discover that the Silmaril was not with the dwarves, but they dared not assail Luthien, right? That's a full narrative sentence that could easily be in the Quenta. Again, notice the difference between that, even when he says, Celgorm and Curufin destroy the dwarf host at Sarnathrad in Rathloriel and are wroth to find the Silmaril not there. There's a little hint. To me, the most telling word in that sentence is the word wroth, right? That tells me that this is not just a note to himself or like a note. This is not like modern editor to modern reader, right? This is him, sort of writing within the idiom of the Silmarillion, even though it still is a pretty simple summary sentence in every other way, right? But no longer, great was the chagrin of the sons of Feanor to discover that the Silmaril was not with the dwarves, but they dared not assail Luthien. Very much the tone and cadence of the Quenta Silmarillion style. But let's keep going. It's only the beginning of stage C. 505 changed to 503 because we want it to coincide with the fall of Doriath, presumably. Birth of Earendel, half-elven in Gondolin. Spring. Everything happens in spring. Here a messenger brought the Silmaril by night to Dior in Doriath, and he wore it, and by its power Doriath revived for a while. But it is believed that in this year Luthien and Beren passed away, for they were never heard of again on earth. Mayhap the Silmaril hastened their end, for the flame of the beauty of Luthien as she wore it was too bright for mortal lands. Hear it again? Come on, that last mayhap, right? Mayhap the Silmaril hastened their end, for the flame of the beauty of Luthien as she wore it was too bright for mortal lands. Tolkien has a really hard time just writing lists, right? Just listing events. He's more and more indulging this narrative mode, right? 511 changed to 509, the second kinslaying. The sons of Feanor assailed Dior, and he was slain. Slain also were Celgorm and Curufin and Cranthir. Eldon and Elrond, sons of Dior, were left in the woods to starve. Elwing escaped and came with the Silmaril to the mouths of Sirion. Ulmo sends a last warning to Gondolin, which now alone is left. But Turgon will have no alliance with any after the kinslaying of Doriath. Maeglin, Eol's son, sister son of Turgon, was taken in the hills and betrayed Gondolin to Morgoth. 512 changed to 510, the fall of Gondolin. Death of King Turgon. Yes. Oh, absolutely, David Michael, you are right. The by night, very much story imagery. Yeah, you can see he's got that whole scene pictured in his head, right? Here a messenger brought the Silmaril by night to Dior in Doriath, right? This is not just we're going to note that the Silmaril moved from this place to that place during this year, right? This is very much an unenvisioned incident. And also notice how he's taking the death of Beren and Luthien. He's still ascribing it to a particular year, but notice how he's changed that, right? From 505, spring, second death of Beren, and Luthien dies also, right? From that matter of fact, he's now gone to, but it is believed that in this year, Luthien and Beren passed away, for they were never heard of again on earth. Mayhap the Silmaril hastened their end, for the flame of the beauty of Luthien as she wore it was too bright for mortal lands. Right now we're it is believed and mayhapping, right, in this sentence. That is not. Remember, the whole point of the Tale of Years is to keep it tidy, right? To make a list of when exactly things actually happened. And now he's not only segueing into narrative, he's actually like quasi-defeating the purpose of that by introducing this sort of, mythic sense of mystery to it, right? It is believed that in this year, Luthien and Beren passed away. Everett is wondering if there's a special reason that he uses sister son instead of nephew. Etymological, I believe. He doesn't like the word nephew. Sister son is a much more Old English way of saying it. Yeah. We get one. I think nephew is from French. I'm not positive about that, but yeah, he doesn't like the word nephew so much. Sister son, much better, much more in keeping. And I would say, by the way, there's another reason for this. Keep in mind, who's writing this text? Or rather, how are we getting the Tale of Years? Who compiled the Tale of Years? Alfwina, probably, right? So yeah, you want to make sure it has that authentic Old English sound to it, All right. Okay, notice that there's another significant change here. Ulmo sends a last warning to Gondolin. So Tuor's there. Marries Idril. Earendil's born. And 6 years later? When Eärendil is 6, Ulmo sends another warning. But Turgon is like, no way. Turgon will have no alliance. I'm sure Christopher must be right when he says, remember Christopher's gloss on this statement, but Turgon will have no alliance with any. Like with any what, right? One of the other versions, he says, with any of the sons of Fëanor. And I'm sure that's what Tolkien meant there. But Turgon will have no alliance with any son of Fëanor after the kinslaying of Doriath. JJ, it is also true that sister son gives you more information, because the sister son and a brother son are totally different, politically speaking. I once heard in one of our Signum MA courses that I did with Tom Shippey years ago. It was about 10 years ago now, almost exactly 10 years ago. The Beyond Middle-earth course, I think it was. Tom gave this whole lecture portion on the difference between your maternal and your paternal uncles in Anglo-Saxon society. Like it was a big deal. One are potential rivals and one are like definite allies, and it's like it's a whole thing. Like, so sister son it's not just a fancy way of saying nephew and avoiding the French word. It's also sister son is in a different category from brother son. Like your brother son might kill you to get your inheritance, right? Your sister son is safe, right? Even in the Lord of the Rings, you can sort of see this, right? Éomer is the heir of Theoden, but because he's his sister's son, he's clearly like the heir of gift, right? It's not like the presumptive heir. He wasn't like Theodred's rival, which he would have been if he was his brother's son, right? If Theoden has one son and then he has a brother who has a son, then there have been knifings in that kind of situation in the past. So instead of creating a situation where Éomer is like the presumptive heir and there's like any kind of, he makes instead Éomer is just like his right hand dude who's close enough to him as his sister son in his family, especially because of course in the case with Theoden and Éomer, he was fostered within his house, right, as if he were his own son, but he's not, right? So again, there's no rivalry between him and Theodred. But yet, yeah, and so it sort of emphasizes sort of Theoden's gift, right? Anyway, this is it is another reason why it's important and why Sister Son is preferable in that way. And of course, in this case, notice that Maegwyn is sister son of Turgon. Remember, Maegwyn's position in the succession is a question, right? And his presumption, right, that he as sister son would presume to like want to be the heir of the king, right? And try to like use that to make himself and then become a rival to, and in fact try to kill Eärendil as the grandson of the king, who would be now the presumptive heir. It just shows like Maegwyn is as bad a sister son as he is a cousin, right? His actions, his political machinations to try to seize power are as unnatural and inappropriate as his sexual desire for his first cousin, right? Anyway, so again, there's a bunch of that weight involved in sister son, I believe. Okay. Anyway, let's keep going because we do keep going, right? Yes, we do. 5:13 changed to 5:11. Tuor and Idril bring Eärendil and the remnant of Gondolin to the mouths of Sirion. So that is right the year after the fall of Gondolin. So we move that back. Okay. Now notice these changes are all things that like he wrote them out with the original dates and then he goes back and crosses out the dates and writes new ones. So he's rethinking some of these things, right? That means, of course, that this third time that he did this, he originally chose to separate the birth of Eärendil from the downfall of Doriath, right? He originally had those in sequential years. Making of the Naglamir, 502. Fall of Doriath, 503. Wedding of Tuor and Idril, 504. Birth of Eärendil, 505. And then afterwards, he's like, nah, can't have it. Right. I gotta go back. I gotta bump I want those back where they were. Right. I want those overlapping, not sequential. And now those changes are kind of working through. Okay, Tuor and Idril bring Eärendil and the remnant of Gondolin to the mouth of Sirion, 527. So our years of peace change, and notice he changes it again. So 513 to 527. So we originally had 14 years of peace now. Notice he ups that to 19 years as he shifts this forward to 530 while he's shifting the original arrival at Mouth of Sirion back to 511. So he ups it to 19 years of peace before Eärendil weds Elwing. Unquiet of Ulmo comes upon Tuor. Tuor and Idril depart over sea and are heard of no more on earth. Now, he retains the mystery about what happens to Tuor and Idril, right? But notice the shift there. From stage A. Where was it here? Tuor and Idril depart over sea. Why? Where are they going? What's their... We get nothing, right? No explanation whatsoever. Now, unquiet of Ulmo comes upon Tuor. Tuor and Idril depart over sea. Same sentence as before, right? And are heard of no more on earth. Once again, that Quenta phrasing style there, right? Okay, now we got 528, which he changed to 530, but then clearly changes again when he changed this other one to 530. He still wants the 4 years. He wants to give Eärendil and Elwing still a few years of marriage before Eärendil goes to sea. Okay. Added entry. So he squeezes this into the margin. 528. Change to 532. Elros and Elrond, twin sons of Eärendil, born. Okay, so we're going to have Elros and Elrond born before Eärendil takes off. That seems like a good idea. 532, change to 534, change to 538, because now we're, again, adapting to these earlier changes. The third and last kinslaying. The havens of Sirion destroyed, and Elros and Elrond, sons of Eärendil, taken captive, but are fostered with care by Maedhros. Elwing carries away the Silmaril and comes to Eärendil, Eärendil with an E, changed to Eärendil with an I, in the likeness of a bird. 536, changed to 40, changed to 42, Eärendil comes to Valinor. Now, I don't want to lean into this too much. It's just a mistake, right? The EL, EARENDL at the end, right? That was the original way he spelled it. That's the old way. That's the Book of Lost Tales spelling of Eärendil. He changes it to Eärendil later on. And like many of this kind of spelling change, this has to do with the way in which the Elvish languages have evolved in Tolkien's mind since then, right? It's not just like, oh, I like it better with an I, right? That's maybe how you or I might think. That is not how Tolkien thought, right? It is instead because there would be Tolkien could give a whole explanation for why it has to be an I instead of an E. But he made a mistake. He reverted to the old form in this paragraph here, right? He did it again. Eärendil taken captive. Sons of Eärendil taken captive, right? Whereas he was IL until that point, and is IL again afterwards, right? No, he did not make up that name. Yes, it came from the poem Christ, and it was spelled with an EL. There. Yes, absolutely. But yeah, that doesn't stop Tolkien, of course, from inventing an entire, not only an entire etymology for Eärendil as an Elvish name, right? But an entire, history of the language, which would explain every point of how the name Eärendil came about, right? So yes, that is the older version. And it is the same as Christ with an E, as from the poem Christ. But anyway, okay. As I say, I don't want to lean too heavily on this, but it's fascinating to me. It's an interesting slip, I think. To me, it's an interesting slip. What I'm tempted to say about it, I don't know that slip is enough to justify this kind of a reading, but there are several places where he seems to be thinking, he is in this stuff, in these later parts of the Tale of Years. He is engaging with stories and material that he's not worked with since the Book of Lost Tales. He's in a very Lost Tales frame of mind, right? This is in many ways him returning to these stories and these events. It's for the first time in 20 years, right? And so that he slips into using the version of Eärendil's name that he's not used in 20 years in the midst of that kind of doesn't surprise me in that way. I'd have a hard time really leaning upon this as evidence of a point. But if I did, I would say that it suggests to me evidence that he is at many points in doing the Tale of Years, kind of re-entering the mindset of the Book of Lost Tales, which brings me back to Fionwe, son of Manwe, from stage A, right? He seems to have changed his mind about the Valar having kids before 1950, when he comes back and rewrites that. Yes, he was working from and kind of making a fair copy of a 1937 version, but he wouldn't keep that kind of thing blindly. He wouldn't just be like, yeah, this is all junk now, right? I've totally changed my world building since then. And so, my world concept. And so if that were true, he wouldn't keep it, right? But the fact that he kept that passage in there, Fionwe, son of Manwe, that to me is a bigger piece of evidence of him kind of getting into a Book of Lost Tales frame of mind when he was writing this. Okay. Anyway, let's go up to stage D, the fourth version. 501. Húrin is released from captivity. He goes to Nargothrond and seizes the treasure of Glaurung. He takes the treasure to Menegroth and casts it at the feet of Thingol. 502. The Nauglamir is wrought of the treasure of Glaurung, and the Silmaril is hung thereon. Thingol quarrels with the dwarves who had wrought for him the necklace. 503. The dwarves of Belagost and Nogrod invade Doriath. King Elu-Thingol is slain and his realm ended. Melian escapes and carries away the Nauglamir and the Silmaril and brings them to Beren and Luthien. She then forsook Middle-earth and returned to Valinor. Okay, notice again the flow of this, right? The events he's describing are the same as the events described before. But now, where what we were seeing before in stage B, especially in stage B, like in stage A, we were seeing mostly the list, right? Here are the events, boom, 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 right? Stage B, we were still getting a lot of that with some little details, like this happened in spring, right? And a few sentences, right? And are wroth to find the Silmaril not there, right? These moments that kind of begin to kind of jump out. In C, we get a lot more narrative, but we still still the basic sort of spine of it, right? Are those lists. Return of Húrin from captivity. Making of the Nauglamir. Sentence fragments, right? Like you would see in a list, right? Not even complete sentences. Making of the Nauglamir. Thingol quarrels with the dwarves. Even though we're getting these sentences and paragraphs that sound much more in that narrative mode. Now here in stage D, no sentence fragments anymore, right? Instead of Húrin released from captivity, we get a complete sentence. And then we follow it up. He goes to Nargothrond and seizes the treasure of Glaurung. He takes the treasure to Menegroth and casts it at the feet of Thingol. We get no real change, no real new narrative there. But there's now in stage D, a thoroughgoing commitment to narrative, right? So remember D1 and D2 are D1 is the TypeScript, and then the TypeScript ends, and then he continues it by hand, presumably later, right? Okay. Yes, you're right, David Michael. This is the first time that it is said that he says explicitly that the Nauglamir is wrought of the treasure of Glaurung, and the Silmaril is hung thereon. We still get no reference to Mime and his curse, right? That is still a non-factor here, which again, huge news, right? But yeah. And I would say, David Michael, this suggests to me, not that, he's bringing that in here and it wasn't involved before, but that's exactly the kind of connective tissue he was not doing before, right? I mean, it was just Húrin brings the gold. Nauglamir made, right? You don't need to spell the cause and effect and like that kind of connective tissue is what narrative is, right? Not chronology list, right? But now he's not content to do that anymore. Now we get the full connective tissue. This, by the way, this is still 503. We're now getting paragraphs within the years. Curufin and Celegorm, hearing of the sack of Menegroth, ambushed the dwarves at the fords of Askar as they sought to carry off the dragon gold to the mountains. The dwarves were defeated with great loss, but they cast the gold into the river, which was therefore after named Rathloriel. Great was the anger of the sons of Feanor to discover that the Silmaril was not with the dwarves, but they dared not to assail Luthien. Dior goes to Doriath and endeavors to recover the realm of Thingol. In this year, or according to others in the year before, Tuor wedded Idril Celebrimbor, Turgon's daughter of Gondolin, and in the spring of the year after was born in Gondolin Eärendil Hathelfin. And then he strikes out this paragraph and says, nope, this must be placed in 502, right? Once again, he's insistent. He tried to do it sequential again, right? Notice also how he's once more appealing to that, according to others, right? That sort of uncertainty, right? Yeah. Yes, right, David Michael, and you're right. They're not just wroth, right? It's not just the one word creeping in. It's now great was their anger, right? The whole narrative flow, right? In the autumn of this year, a messenger brought by night the Silmaril to Dior in Doriath. And now we don't even get notice he doesn't even talk about the death of Beren and Luthien. It's left completely mysterious. We did get, yes, I mean, it's implied, right? Because we get the Melian carries away the Nauglamir and the Silmaril and brings them to Beren and Luthien. So Beren and Luthien have them, right? And then Dior leaves them and goes to Doriath and endeavors to recover the realm of Thingol. And then a messenger brought by night the Silmaril to Dior and Doriath. No comment on what that implies, right? So now instead of saying, yeah, this is when Beren and Luthien die, he first cloaked it in mystery and myth, and now is completely silent about it, which is actively inimical to the entire project of making A Tale of Years, right? You're not supposed to just imply what may have happened in a given year, right? Yeah. And yeah, David Michael, he shifts it to autumn. And I agree. I think that he shifts it to autumn in order to increase. He's like implying more heavily, right? He's leaning into that. The implication, rather, of their death, of the end of that, the summertime, the autumn of Beren and Luthien has come to an end. Winter now returns. Remember, we got that very metaphorical structure in the winter of Thingol, remember? That is healed by Luthien upon her return. Anyway. Yeah. Okay. Now here's his continuation, his handwritten continuation. 503. Elwing the White, daughter of Dior, born in Osiriand. 504. Dior returns to Doriath, and with the power of the Silmaril restores it, but Melian departed to Valinor. Dior now publicly wore the Nauglamir and the jewel. 505. The sons of Fëanor, hearing news of the Silmaril that it is in Doriath, hold council. Maedhros restrains his brethren, but a message is sent to Dior demanding the jewel. Dior returns no answer. Again, remember how we just got in stage A, we just got completely out of nowhere, second kinslaying, right? Then we got the intervention of the Fëanorians at the ford, fighting the dwarves in order to build up their active interest, their military intervention, seeking the Silmaril, and their frustration, right? And now we're getting the whole build-up, right? 506. Celegorn inflames the brethren, and they prepare an assault on Doriath. They come up at unawares in winter, again with the seasons, right? Yeah. 506 to 507. At Yule, Dior fought the sons of Fëanor on the east marches of Doriath and was slain. There fell also Celegorn by Dior's hand, and Curufin and Cranthir. The cruel servants of Celegorn seized Dior's sons, Elrond and Eldon, and leave them to starve in the forest. Nothing certain is known of their fate, but some say that the birds succored them and led them to Asir. In the margin, Maedhros, repenting, seeks unavailingly for the children of Dior. The lady Lindis escaped with Elwing, and came hardly to Asir with the necklace and the jewel. Thence, hearing the rumour, she fled to the havens of Sirion. 509. Maegwyn captured by spies of Melkor. Sauron. 5:10. Midsummer. Assault and sack of Gondolin, owing to treachery of Maegwyn, who revealed where it lay. So let me not pass over that really fascinating little tidbit, right? The Sauron ? Remember what happens to Sauron in the Silmarillion after his defeat by Luthien and Huan. Remember what happens to Sauron afterwards? Nothing, right? He flies away in the form of a bat dripping blood, and we never hear from him again. Never hear about him again until the Akalabeth, right? So here we see Tolkien imagining. Tolkien is returning to this question. Sauron has only been growing in importance, since the beginning, right? He needs to account for Sauron. What's Sauron up to? He's not been doing nothing, right? So, his suggestion here is that Sauron was instrumental in the fall of Gondolin by being the one who captured Maegwyn and brings Maegwyn before Morgoth and brings about his treachery. 5:11, exiles of Gondolin, Tuor, Idril, and Eärendil, etc., reach Sirion, which now prospers in the power of the Silmaril. 5:12, sons of Feanor learn of the uprising of the New Havens and that the Silmaril is there, but Maedhros forswears his oath. 5:25, 14 quiet years. The unquiet of Ulmo came upon Tuor, and he built a ship, Earame, and departed into the west with Idril and Veronwe, and is heard of in no tale since. Eärendil wedded Elwing, and became lord of the men of the Havens. By the way, I kind of enjoy the implication, which is sort of latent through all four stages of this story, that Eärendil and Elwing don't get married until Eärendil's parents take off, right? Like, I'm going to miss mom and dad. I mean, like, did they not approve or something? Did, Idril and Elwing not get along or something? And it wasn't until the father and mother-in-law are out of the picture that Elwing makes her move? I don't know. But it's just interesting to me that the two of them always get married, in this case, very promptly, as soon as, no sooner Tuor and bye, mom and dad, see you later. Okay, let's start planning the wedding. Yeah. I'm not trying to throw shade on their wedding. I don't think there's anything sketchy there. I find that really interesting. Interesting because I would have, it subdivides the time there into three stages, basically. I'm thinking like the peaceful years before the third kinslaying, right? There is a post third kinslaying, final miserable survival mode thing, right? But prior to the third kinslaying, it divides the time of peace between the establishment of this final refuge by the mouths of Sirion and the third kinslaying. It divides that in half, right? We get the Tuor and Idril phase, in which Tuor and Idril are sort of in charge of things, right? And then the Eärendil and Elwing phase. And the fact that I would have thought that maybe Eärendil and Elwing would have gotten married during that first period of peace. Under the, watchful and loving eyes of Tuor and Idril, right? They get married but no, it's a separate stage. It's a separate story, right? Yeah, Arthur, Celegorm's name, Celegorm with an M, is later. I don't remember exactly when that changes. I don't remember exactly when that changes. This, by the way, is a kind of thing that Christopher did a lot, was regularize the spelling of names, which change over time. He kind of chose one, and yeah. Yeah, I know that as Chad is pointing out, Celegorn is the older version, which is again why Christopher used the M version, Celegorm, in the published Silmarillion. But notice there's a lot of older versions of the names being used here, Maedhros as well. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Torment fell upon Maedhros and his brethren, Maglor, Damrod, and Diriel. That's Emrod and Emros for those keeping score at home, because of their unfulfilled oath. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. Okay. Notice again, one of the things that's to me very, very pronounced in stage 4 here, as he's giving rein more fully to his narrative impulse here. And this is slowly becoming another set of annals, just like in the same thing is happening to this that was happening to the annals. What we see about this story is that it shifts more and more explicitly. Notice how prominently this story is now a story of the Feanorians, right? The Curse of Feanor and the struggle for the Silmaril has really taken center stage all the way back, in the TypeScript version of D, when we get Curufin and Celegorm ambushing the dwarves, right? All the way through to the stages and the debates and Maedhros trying to restrain them, but Celegorn and Curufin out for blood and Dior defying them, right? The whole build up to the second kinslaying, and then the response afterwards and Maedhros' repentance and, trouble among them, even to now he's forswearing his oath. Right, he hears of the uprising of the New Haven. He hears that the Silmaril is there. Not only does Maedhros say, "Okay, but you know what? I'm going cold turkey again." Right, he has to get a new badge. Right, it's been, "Hi, my name is Maedhros." It's been, what has it been now exactly in stage D? We can fill it out. When was the kinslaying? 506. Okay, it's been 6 years, right? It's been 6 years since I last slew one of my kin, right? He fell off the wagon 6 years ago, but it's now he's been clean for 6 years again. He's not just trying to stay clean. He forswears his oath. This is a big deal, right? He's forswearing his oath. He is not just resisting it. He has taken the active step to say, I am not going. He's taking an oath to not follow the oath, right? And then torment falls upon Maedhros and his brethren because of their unfulfilled oath, right? The story of the Oath of Feanor continuing to work, continuing to... so JJ says, can he do that? Not successfully, apparently, right? It's not going to work out. But again, my point is, if this is a unified narrative that Tolkien is forming here, the story, the primary story, it seems to me to be the story of the Sons of Feanor and of the Oath of Feanor and how the Oath of Feanor continues to work and continues to wreck things, right? It really takes center stage. Okay. We've come to Christopher's note on chapter 22 of the Ruin of Doriath in the published Silmarillion. But we're also almost at the end of time. We have a few more minutes. I could talk about this some, but it seems dumb to begin this section. I have a few slides that I want to go through a good deal of what Christopher says here, because I think this is a really fascinating moment. one of these moments, which we've gotten several times in the War of the Jewels, of Christopher looking back at his editorial choices in doing the published Silmarillion, which he's now, what is he? 20 years, Christopher? 20 years removed from that? What's the date? I always forget the dates of these. When was the War of the Jewels published? What do we got? We got 94. Okay. So, yeah, pretty close. I mean, he's 20 years from the beginning of the process of doing that. So, yeah, it's pretty close. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we'll get to, but I don't want to rush through this. I don't want to try to rush through this in 5 minutes. So let's save this. We'll do this at the beginning next time. I'm going to warn you in advance. I have a few things to observe. There are some things that I find really fun about the Quendi and Eldar part 4 of this book, but I'm not going to lie. I am no philologist, and most of it is way over my head. I am not going to be able to answer almost anybody's questions about this section. I barely know enough to follow along with what Tolkien is saying and doing in those sections. And so here's what I am going to do, though, what I am interested in. What I want to do is I want to look at what we can see, the way that we can see illustrated in this long section, which he's just going through etymologies and shifts and comparative languages and things for these particular words and particular word elements. Tolkien talked about how his stories all emerged from his languages. It began with the languages and him making up the languages, and the stories came from that. We talked about that. I talked about how much more clearly I could see that after our discussions of the Hlamas, the Tree of Tongues, back in, I think, was it Volume 5 or Volume 4? I can't remember which. But anyway, back then when we were looking at that, I could begin to see that so much more clearly after we were studying that together. What I want to look at, what my primary interest, what I'm going to focus on as we go through part 4 of the War of the Jewels, briefly, not in great detail, are those moments when we can begin to see this again, when we can begin to see the way that the sort of symbiosis between Tolkien's development of his languages, his invented languages, and the growth of his stories. The ways in which we can see these two things kind of working together and sort of informing each other. And I think we can see some glimpses of those things when we go through and read the etymologies. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be focused on. So don't expect a thorough explanation, because I don't have it to give. It is above my my own understanding. But we will talk through some tidbits here and there through part 4 that I think are really interesting. But I'm not planning on spending that long on it. So it is my hope and plan that next week will be our final session on the War of the Jewels. Remember, coming up next is going to be Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis, the greatest work of fiction ever written by C.S. Lewis. We're gonna, I don't have a date yet, Tomas. I'll try to have a plan for that for you for next week. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but then we'll come back probably in September to begin Till We Have Faces. But I'll have that for you more certainly. But my hope and plan is to finish the War of the Jewels next week. All right. Thanks everybody for joining me, and I will see you next week for the end of the War of the Jewels. Talk to you later. Bye now.